Hello peeps, this is Hillbilly Halfwit here, and today we're talking about the Scottish Government going back on all its climate promises. If you remember, we did a video the other day showing this lady here being skewered by a really good reporter, and because they hadn't reached any of the targets they'd invented out of thin air, so now they decided to remove the targets. Before we go on, I'd just like to thank everybody for commenting and rating and subscribing. Really enjoy reading all your comments when they're there, because sometimes they disappear, and you know that YouTube's on my case at the moment, so doing a bit of shadow banning, so please comment, rate and subscribe and share this stuff. So let's get going. As I said before, we did a video on her the other day where she was basically skewered for not admitting that they'd missed all the targets. So, as I say all the time, the elephant in the room is they want to tax the poorest in society. That is what it's all about. Taxing the poorest in society to get goals they've made up. Scotland to ditch key climate change target. The Scottish Government is to ditch the flagship target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2030. The final goal of reaching net zero by 2045 will remain, but BBC Scotland News understands the government's annual climate target could also go. Ministers have missed 8 of the last 12 annual targets and have been told that reaching the 75% milestone by the end of the decade is unachievable. They made it up, that's why. They made it up. When Greta Thunberg went to Scotland, they decided to try and be the best in the world, and they decided to skewer the poorest in society to make themselves look good with the false god Greta. A statement is expected in Holyrood on Thursday afternoon, which is today. The Climate Change Committee, which provides independent advice to the ministers, warned back in 2002 that Scotland had lost its lead over the rest of the UK in tackling the issue. Why does it need to have a lead? The UK is as a whole. Last year, ministers failed to publish a plan it promised required under the Act, detailing how they were going to meet the targets. Then in March of this year, the Climate Change Committee said for the first time that the 2030 target was unreachable. Of course it was, because it's skewing the poor in society. Former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon saw an SNP administration as world leaders on climate change when targets were introduced in 2019, often asserting that Scotland had the most stretching targets in the world. Yes, because they wanted to look good, never minding if it hurted the people. Hers was the first government in the world to declare a climate emergency, and Glasgow hosted the COP26 climate summit in 21. Yet environmentalists believe the emergency response never came. Now I remember this. That was at the end of the first batch of COVID, and at that time, when all them people went to Scotland to that climate conference, that's what started the second batch of COVID, because there was over 20 to 30,000 people flew in. And that's when the second strain started. Now, people can deny that, but that's what happened. Now, we all know it, but it was all kept quiet. But here we go. So scrapping targets will be seen as an embarrassing retreat for the SNP and the Scottish Greens. They're partners in the Scottish Government. Scotland's emission reduction target for 2030 was tougher than the rest of the UK as a whole, which was the reduction of 68% for the same date. Where did the targets come from? There was a febrile atmosphere around back in 2019 when the Scottish Parliament passed its large landmark legislation to speed up the rate of decarbonisation. It was the height of the school climate strikes, and just a few days earlier, thousands had taken to the streets in support of Greta Thunberg's call for more action. That's what it's all about. Politics to fucking frighten people. That's what it's all about. These false god on the left is a new religion. At Holyrood, parties were trying to outbid each other on how quickly the country could go, eventually setting on a pace far beyond what experts had planned for. The Scottish Greens, who are now in government with the SNP, proposed aiming to cut emissions by a whopping 80% compared with a baseline of 1990. But Parliament settled on 75%, still 5% more than recommended, and the climate change bill was agreed by all parties except the Greens, who abstained. One former minister told me there was a lack of realism at the time. There's a lack of realism now, because we've dropped 50% of our emissions already. I've showed that the other day. The new legislation required ministers to set annual targets for reducing emissions. In a sense, it was a hostage to fortune, with the yearly totals heavily influenced by the winter weather, which determines how much gas we use to heat up our homes. But so how is it bloody being warmer if it's cooler? They contradict themselves. But the trend was clear, as 8 out of 12 of the targets were missed. That has just made me laugh. They're blaming the cold winter for having to use more electricity to heat up your homes when they're saying it's hotter. Can you make this stuff up? With the closure of Scotland's last coal-fired power station in Longanat in 2016, politicians conceded with the low-hanging fruit that had been picked, and any future progress would require big changes on how we live our lives. Because they are trying to hurt the people that are voting for them. This is not going to end well. But the Greens believe the current system has fundamentally failed, with too much emphasis placed on targets rather than policies. That might be how the Greens try to convince their voters that scrapping the targets will be the right decision. Scottish Greens climate spokesman Mark Russell said the party was absolutely determined to accelerate the urgent and substantial action needed to tackle the climate crisis as laid out by the Climate Change Committee recently, and fully experts of the Scottish Government to respond to the challenge. They're barking mad. Have emissions been falling? The short answer is yes, but by not enough. It's fell by 50%. Listen to this here. By 2021, greenhouse gas emissions had fallen by nearly 50% compared to the baseline level of 1990. So we dropped it by 49.2% now. But no, that's not enough. That is a massive half of our planet's warming gases which have already been eradicated from the economy, and it hasn't done anything. Because it doesn't do anything. When are they going to get this? We have dropped 50% of our gases and nothing has changed. But the law requires 51.1% to fall by that date to keep on track. Some industries have seen huge changes that have driven down emissions, like the energy and waste sector. Others have remained stubbornly unmoved, such as transport and agriculture. It is likely the Scottish Government would replicate the system of carbon budgets used in the UK and the Welsh Government, rather than annual targets, because they've missed everyone and it was unachievable. Ministers would be told how much greenhouse gas could safely be emitted during a Parliament term and have to come up with some plan to achieve that. It would mean an end to a legal requirement of successive Environment Secretaries having to explain to Parliament why targets have been missed. It's impossible to hit the targets because it isn't doing anything. There is an argument that the annual targets are a distraction because emissions are influenced by many factors, including weather, cold weather that's supposed to be hot, and people are having to use their electric fires to keep them warm is a problem, apparently. What if we all starve in our houses? That'd make it better, wouldn't it? And that overall trend is more important. Having been the first government in the world to declare a climate emergency, scrapping targets will be an embarrassing retreat. What will this government do now? Ministers have a conundrum. They are legally required to produce a climate change plan which details how they will achieve their targets. That no longer exist. That plan is now long delayed, and the Climate Change Committee confirmed last month that the flagship 2030 target was beyond reach. So it's just not possible to produce a plan anymore. An option would be to set new targets in existing legislation and then produce a plan. But one official described those annual targets as nothing more than meaningful than a straight line and a graph. So abolishing them altogether and perhaps setting a lower 2030 target seems the most likely course of action. This is what it's all about, people. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. They have got themselves into a position where they are inventing targets to reach, and to get to these targets they are skewering the poor in society that voted for them. The UK has dropped its emissions by 50% since 1990, and that still is not enough for them, even though China and all other countries in Asia are spewing out this stuff like you've never seen. Pakistan and India release more CO2 and carbon in half a year than the UK has since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And not forgetting that 1860 mean temperatures, that was compared to these days is only 0.3 of a degree different. So that is it. So please comment, rate and subscribe, and all the best, guys.